All right. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Conscious Communication, the third training of our series. If you weren't able to attend the Code of Curiosity training or the Code of Empathy training from the last couple months, I highly recommend you check those out at the Dish Women's Network page. I'm Lacey Geddes, the training manager for the Dish Women's Network, and I'm excited to be able to present this training today along with all of our employee resource groups. If you're not currently a member of any of our resource groups, please make sure to check them out at the hop. And with that, I am excited to welcome back Nina and Yubi, and I will go ahead and hand it over.
All right. Hi, everybody. This is kind of bittersweet. This is our last one with you all, but it's really been just great and great way to kind of close out the year. So thank you all for being here again. Let's jump in. Nina, you want to run us through traffic light check-in to kick it off?
Yeah, so let's go ahead and do the exercise that we've done during the last trainings, but I'll remind you what it's about. So the traffic light check-in is a way for you to actually start connecting with the people in your teams. It's something that we've implemented on a daily basis with our teams as a way to start recognizing that our brains don't always work 100% every day, but it's really important to be able to communicate kind of where we're at so we can all bring our most authentic selves to the workplace without having to get too personal. So basically, in the traffic light check-in, you go around the room and everyone says what color they are. Green means I'm good to go, ready to hit the ground running. Yellow means I'm struggling a little bit, but I'm still there and I'm able to do everything that I can. Red means I'm really overwhelmed and maybe could use a little bit of support or graciousness. So if you wouldn't mind just typing in the chat what color you are today, as well as what your preferred pronouns are, we can go ahead and do that, and then we'll get started right afterwards.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you everybody for that. It's great again just to kind of continue to recognize and work together as teammates and as coworkers to really just better understand each other and better learn how to communicate. And that's what today is all about, is sort of understanding, being more aware of how we communicate, both verbally and non-verbally, and how we can use bias awareness and bias mitigation techniques and empathy to just drive better communication, better interaction in everything we do, right? It's from a simple conversation on Zoom or in the hallways to an interview. And so that's what we're talking about today. The key, again, just to remember here is, we want you to be here participating with us. So please feel free to, use the chat for a lot of that, ask questions as we go. We'll ask for some participation and conversation as well. But just, again, keeping an open mind, remembering that this is a safe, vulnerable place for all of us to continue to be honest with ourselves, to self-reflect on our bias journeys and how our empathy works, and to drive forward with a curious mindset. So where we wanted to get started was just to kind of turn it back on everybody who was able to attend any of the other sessions. What are some things that you've learned that stuck with you, that you've been able to apply to your daily life? We'd love to, and I guess if people can unmute, we'd love to hear from you that way, or if you want to just throw it in the chat, that'd be great.
Yeah, Yubi, I would say definitely just learning how to be more curious and open-minded, and especially right now. It's a crazy time, but definitely just keeping my open mind and being curious about everyone and in my life.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest thing, right? If we can just build that competency. It's amazing how that alone and learning more about people, particularly when we can't physically be together, changes our perspectives and thought processes and mindset on a lot of different things. Just having that extra knowledge really is quite amazing. That's awesome. Thank you. And then Gustavo mentioned empathy versus sympathy. Yeah, a lot of this stuff, there are layers to it, right? It's not as simple as one word, one concept, and what that means. Bias, again, isn't positive or negative in and of itself. There's many layers to that. Some biases are good. Some biases have kept us alive. There's also multiple layers to this idea of empathy and what empathy really is and how it can be used and how we navigate that spectrum. And today we're going to get into some very applicable, like right now, applicable concepts that, again, drive how we communicate with each other. And, they're really important to understand because you hear them, these concepts, these words thrown out, but again, there's a lot more to it than sort of what's the standard definition that's put out there in the media, on social media, or whatever. So great. Thank you for those. Anybody else? Any questions about the last two sessions? Yeah, Leslie, you're spot on. I mean, that's a big realization, I think, for a lot of people, is just, that this is work that we all have to do. That nobody is exempt from this type of work because it just makes us better people. And we're all biased. So we all are starting from the same point, right? And in this journey. And again, that's nothing to feel guilty about. It doesn't mean we're broken people. We're just human. And we, I think that there's sort of an obligation there to want to be better, to be better towards each other, to be better within our communities. And, because at the end of the day, the outcome is better. The outcome at work is better. If we work better as a team, we treat each other better as a team, we're going to build better things. And that's really a great thing, and will impact people in a more positive way. All right, awesome. Well, Jesus, empathy is something I try to focus on every time I have the opportunity to apply. Yeah, I mean, right? Like empathy it's always on. I think one of the key points we wanted to make last time in the empathy training was, it's constantly there. It's a dynamic part of our lives. It's something we're navigating, and we have to better understand ourselves in order to understand how to better present empathy within a given situation. It's also something, that we need to recognize when are at our capacity. We can't all operate on those levels of empathy all the time. Like, we have to give ourselves a little grace and be able to step out and take care of ourselves every once in a while, especially for people who lead teams, right? Like, it's constantly having to try to live in that compassionate empathy level, which is hearing and understanding what our employees are feeling, but not letting our emotions get in the mix of that, and proactively finding ways to help them. That's hard to do all the time. It just can't be done. And so we've got to also have empathy for ourselves and learn to take care of ourselves. And sometimes that means exiting out of that empathy spectrum. And then, so Leslie, this training has made me more aware of my own biased thinking. That awareness is key to changing and being better. Yeah. The awareness piece is huge. If you can't become unaware. Once you're aware of your own biases and the things that, trigger you, it's hard to forget that. You can't stop thinking about it. So that's the biggest hurdle. And then after that, it's just, okay, now how do I just behave a little bit better every day? Yeah, and Jesus, I mean, you're right? Like COVID has taught us that there is no work versus life, right? These aren't separate things anymore. It's just life. We're all living it, and so we as human beings are who we are, no matter work or life, right? Like we're just who we are, and so these things are at play all the time. And so, I know a lot of us in the past have put on sort of our work hats versus our home hats, but now it's just one hat. And that makes it even more important to kind of learn this stuff and balance it too, because it's that in and of itself is an emotional drain to keep those two things separate. Paula says, for me, it is about being present, and this training continues to tell that story. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, COVID has been quite the opportunity, right? Because even though we are isolated from each other, experiences like this, where virtually we're on a screen, do sort of force us to be more present. It's very easy to be distracted or turn off our cameras, and so it's a great way for us to practice that being present for each other, and then that takes empathy, right? And using empathy in the right way to present ourselves and to be able to communicate like that. Awesome. These have been great. Thank you. So Nina, what do you say we kick off the conscious communication?
Yeah. So the goal of this really is to start breaking down all the verbal and nonverbal ways we communicate to one another. It's empathy model. It's not something I created, but I found it to be a very powerful way to just start thinking about all the things that your body is doing, all the things that you're saying that go beyond just the words that are coming out of your mouth. Because we communicate in such complex ways. Our communication styles are actually way more complex than we think, than we realize. And we pick up on communication from other people in really subtle ways that you might not realize either. So we're gonna start breaking it down into this model so you can start seeing kind of how this all works. So the first thing, the E stands for eye contact. So this is actually a really interesting thing because eye contact obviously has changed a lot in this world of moving into video communications. But, in that traditional in-person setting, eye contact speaks volumes. Looking someone directly in the eye in some cultures kind of shows that sign that you're paying attention and you're really interested in what the other person's saying. But in other cultures, direct eye contact can be interpreted as like an affront and like an aggressive, challenging authority type move. But what we have to, and also if we're going to be inclusive of people who are neurodiverse, if you're talking to someone that's got social anxieties or autism or Asperger's syndrome, it may be difficult for them to make direct eye contact. So, one of the things that we really need to think about is just how are we using our eyes when we're talking to people? And I think one of the things that I've really picked up in this world of Zoom and on video conferencing is that looking, you don't necessarily have to look directly into the camera, but people feel a sense of being paid attention to when you are looking at least at the screen below your camera. When I look at my secondary screen and I'm looking at this, it does look like I'm distracted and I'm not paying attention. So one of the things we should consider is like if we really want to communicate that we're listening to another person, we need to think about how we're using our eyes and how we're doing that. The second thing is around muscle and facial expressions. So here's the thing, while eye contact is not necessarily a universal thing, muscle and facial expressions are actually pretty universal, like cross cultures. And we have these different expressions for happiness, sadness, anger, fear. And again, they're pretty consistent across cultures, but like our facial expressions actually communicate a lot to what is saying and what's happening internally. It's actually expressing a lot of the emotions that we're feeling internally and kind of putting that out into the world. So again, something to be aware of as you're talking to other people is, what is going on with their face and their body and everything like that. And how is that being interpreted, and what's happening with your own face and body as you're conveying information to other people. And that kind of goes into the third one, which is
just sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to tie this back to empathy, right? Like we talked about the brain's ability, mirror neurons to understand just by looking at people, even people we don't know, to understand what they're feeling, to even feel that within ourselves, right? And so, one thing that's really critical here is sometimes our facial expressions can betray us, because even if we're trying to communicate one thing, our facial expressions are maybe conveying a different message to someone on the receiving end, even through a Zoom call. And that can again create a feeling within that other person that we didn't intend, but it's there. And so we have to recognize that within ourselves, and understand, like, okay, if I'm more aware, can I sort of control that, and can I put out a unified message through my facial expressions and through what I'm actually saying?
Yeah, and then actually we'll dive into that a little bit more in the A part of empathy. But like the other part is posture. So how we hold ourselves, how our body kind of sits and stands, it conveys, again, it's a nonverbal communication that conveys a lot of information. So this actually, if you go to like an evolutionary biology, there's a theory behind this, that a closed posture, when you kind of have your arms folded across your chest and your legs crossed, what you're actually doing is you're in a really protective state. You're protecting the most vulnerable parts of your body when you're hunched over. You're protecting your neck, your gut, and your genitals, which are the most vulnerable parts of your body. And so a closed posture is kind of symbolizing that sense of like, I'm not really open to communication. But there's lots of other types of things that our posture does. Like think about like when you're sitting or standing, are you leaning in when you're talking to someone? Are you leaning away? Are you turned directly towards them, or are you turned away? Are you mimicking their posture? Again, going back to the mirror neurons, these are things that actually happen all the time, quite often. I know I'm very particularly prone to this, is that I actually do mirror someone. So if I see someone on the camera going like this, I tend to end up going like this too. But it's my way of, showing interest in what they're saying. But it's something I started becoming more aware of the more I started aware of, like, how is my posture conveying stuff, and how am I really listening to others in that way. Yubi, do you want to go into the affect piece? Because you kind of started hinting on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And just to kind of maybe close up on posture, I think we've got to think about all kinds, right, of people, and this goes back to sort of the discussion around how we're not all the same, right, and we don't all bring ourselves to work in the same way. Does anybody can anybody think of an example or an experience maybe that they've had with someone with a disability where maybe they misread posture in a conversation with someone? Does anybody want to share some or have an example of that, or what's kind of the issue there?
UBI can speak. This is Gus from
Hey,
Supply
Gus.
Chain. How you doing?
Good, man.
England.
Yeah.
I have a father-in-law who's actually just recently diagnosed with a dementia, part of Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really interesting because up until he was diagnosed, we were just, thought that maybe he was acting differently, maybe was unaware of things that were going on, did not remember things. And it got to a point where family members were actually getting a little bit loud, in responses to, he forgot certain things. And in the end, it was really interesting because he looked back confused at us thinking, well, why are we being so verbose? And instead of literally asking him his question. And it wasn't until he repeated questions within, let's just say, less than an hour.
Yeah.
And the same thing, that we realized that something was different. And so in reality, he was actually being honest and sincere, and was really, inquisitive about what was going on, but yet we were just tired of repeating ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, and it points to sort of our biology a little bit, because in instances like that, whether it's a disability or whether it's like dementia or Alzheimer's or things like that, there's this interesting compartmentalization, I think, that's happening physically, where the body is sort of acting on its own, right? There's maybe not a conscious control there, as there might be with someone who is normal presenting, right? So that's something for us to think about, because people with disabilities, right, like if they might not be able to sit for long periods of time, but unless we understand that, or unless we ask questions about that with someone who has MS, for example, or something like that, like if we don't know, we may then misinterpret the shuffling in a chair, or the fact that they are leaning forward because that's more comfortable for them. So posture is a super interesting one, and when we look through the lens of accessibility, I think that really opens us up to better understanding ourselves and better understanding this form of communication, because there's some very physical, automatic things that happen. Again, going back to bias and empathy, and how some of those are very automatic within us, right? By these biological functions, they just happen, something unconscious bias. That's why it's called that. Same thing physically. And so the awareness is just critical, but not only for ourselves, but for the person we're communicating with.
Heather brings up a really interesting point around being extremely hard of hearing. And so you count on your eyes and your vision more to get information. And I think that's a really good point, because when we all have different ways of communicating verbally and non-verbally, and we also have different ways of perceiving communication as well. I've experienced that, especially when I've done international travel and I don't know the language. I count a lot more on all the nonverbal forms of communication to really understand situations and understand what people are saying. So that's a really great point, Heather, that it's like one of the things that we need to be aware of too, that not all of us communicate in the same way, and that the information that we may be giving off can be interpreted in a lot of ways too. And then how do we give graciousness to one another as we start to learn how different people's verbal and nonverbal communications come out and appear to folks?
I would say that, especially with the hearing, we tend to communicate at large via speech and receive that language through hearing. When that goes away, people are completely astounded at, like, well, how do I communicate with you? And then I'm just tend to be there. But it's been very interesting to kind of witness how many people just let you be there. They're not aware of the body language. They're not aware of the nuances that come up with not being able to understand. So you've got to kind of further withdraw. And I do a lot of observation. I did before I lost my hearing. And people are just unaware of that. If you're not speaking in a manner that they're used to, it's almost like they don't know what to do. And so they don't do anything.
Yeah.
So awareness is huge.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. And, it's again, I think, there's this standard or ideal, right, that we all have grown up with and come to understand is, like the ideal candidate, right, or the standard norm. But at the end of the day, there aren't a lot of people that fit that, right? It's the majority of people fit all around those concepts. And so, but that's again how we're taught. That's how we're taught to understand the world around us and to live by and to recognize. We recognize the norm. We don't recognize everything around it. And so, it's to your point, Heather, like spot on, right? Like it's awareness. Like we've got to be aware, and we've got to break away from just believing in the norm and realizing that everybody is so much more different. There shouldn't be a norm. I don't think anybody fits the norm, right? There's Nina, what's the name of the book?
The End of Average.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great book to understand how we as even, I think as a country have focused on averages and building things around the average, when in reality, nobody actually fits just the average. One of the stories that sticks out from the book for me is building cockpits for fighter jets. They built it based on the average. Nicole, it's called The End of Average by Todd Rose. But the cockpit was built based on averages, the average human being. So then when they started testing it, there were multiple fatalities because there was no one that fit that average. So the controls weren't in the right place. And so they had to scrap that and go back to a different form of measurement. But that was a very stark example to me of how that happens, standardized testing. There's a lot of things that we try to put people into standardized boxes when in reality, most people don't fit into that. And Hannah, thank you for sharing that story, about the resource room. Because there's a good intent, right, to want to give somebody a hug, but without understanding how that's going to be received or understanding and being aware of the other person, we don't know how it's going to be received necessarily. And so,
yeah, I was totally wrong about what they wanted, but also I don't feel that environment was really adequate at all. I don't think that at that time they had done enough research about integration. And also I was super humiliated and was so embarrassed and put down. And so it was just horrible because I didn't get over it for a long time. I didn't know how to overcome it for a while.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Sorry, there was an echo. I thought somebody was talking. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard journey. Like none of this is easy, but I think we're just on a much better path now because there's so much more awareness around a lot of these. So thank you for sharing that. So yeah, let's jump into affect. So affect in the empathy model is kind of going back to empathy and understanding feeling and mood, right? We talked about when somebody comes into a room and they are exhibiting anxiety or anger or something, right? The rest of us can feel that. And it can change the mood in that meeting, in that room, in that party, or whatever it is. So affect, again, a lot of times it's not something that we necessarily are conscious of, and the effect we have on people and the mood that we can bring into a situation, in a conversation, when we think about interviewing. If it's funny how whether if I'm interviewing somebody before lunch and I'm really hungry, that's a different mood that I'm going to be in than after lunch, and so that changes the conversation. It's as simple as that, but it can change the trajectory of a conversation. And so, by being more aware of how we carry emotion and feeling and how we exhibit it, that can help us to consciously make a better decision in terms of how we're going to present, especially when it is an important conversation. For example, like, hey, we're going to hire someone new to our team, so I've got to bring myself into that situation the best I can, and open that up and let the other person know that hey, I want this to be a safe, vulnerable place for you to be yourself as well. And then there's tone of voice. Tone of voice is an interesting one because, a lot of times it's not what you said, it's how you said it, right? We've heard that all before. But what's key to remember here is, because language is super important, and I think we see that in social media and written word and articles and media and things like that, right? The actual way we say things, from a language perspective is incredibly important. But then you add in that when we communicate in this way, that tone of voice, that can change the message, that can skew the message and how it's delivered a little bit. And we just have to remember that. Because again, a lot of times we don't know we're doing it. We don't know that our tone of voice has changed. It can come across as skepticism, when a teammate is maybe sharing an idea and we respond. We may be responding with language that's positive and supportive, but our voice may indicate skepticism. So that's another huge nonverbal that we have to be more aware of. Does anybody have an example of kind of a tone of voice situation that maybe didn't go the right way that you intended? Nina, I'm trying to think of one that we've had together.
Oh yeah, no, I remember the first one that we had when I was with working with our CEO.
Scary.
Sorry, did someone have something to share? Okay, I'll finish my story and then I'll open it back up because I really do want to hear from you. And so whenever I threw out an idea out there, he would say, "Huh."
Yeah.
I always thought it was a really dismissive thing. He said just the way he said, "Huh."
Right.
But really what he was trying to convey was that it was an interesting idea and he was trying to process it. But what he had to do was recognize there was a word there, but also recognize what was the kind of tone of voice associated with that. And then honestly, we had to use verbal communication to break it down and actually say, what are you thinking when you say those words, huh?
Yeah, that's funny.
It's not just the tone itself. Like you have to think about like your timbre, your volume, the speed in which you're talking, the clarity, like how you're projecting. All of that stuff is interlayered with the tone of voice. So yeah, putting it out there to you all again. Do you have examples that you could share with us?
Yeah, actually, Nina, very similar to that. I had a team member who every time we were talking to a business partner and he was trying to get information, he'd go, mm-hmm. And it was like I had to have a conversation with him and be like, what do you mean when you say that? Because this is how it's coming off to people, which is kind of like, yeah, like you're wrong, or yeah, you should have known that. And that was not how he interpreted or meant it to be interpreted. And so we did have to have, again, additional communication to get aligned on what that meant. I also think right now it's kind of eliminating tone of voice, but it's, again, in this virtual world of, chat and not having that tone or reading the tone in your own mind is something I think we also need to be aware of right now.
Absolutely. That's a really good point.
I think we should be required to provide tone in the chat message, right? Like find the corresponding emoji that says this is meant to be sarcastic.
Well, that is part of the value of emojis. It is being used for that specific reason.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. That's funny. But I think we should do that with every sentence almost, or there should be some kind of automatic way that sort of it gets to know you, right? And says, okay, Yubi's actually being very sarcastic here. All right, Nina, what's the next one? What's H?
Yeah, so H is when you start really taking all this stuff together, and it's really about hearing the whole person. So it's taking a step back and really actively listening to the words that they're saying, but also the nonverbal cues that they're giving, and then really withholding judgment. To hear a whole person, you really have to take a step back and stop thinking about what do you want to add to the conversation? What's your response going to be? And stop that calculating and just really having patience, controlling your own body language. Because again, we have a very implicit reaction. Our body does convey a lot of information, and we might start conveying that before we've really finished listening to the other person. So thinking about how can we be aware of all of these things so we can actually be better listeners and really understand what the other person's saying, so we can get to a place where our response, and that's the why, that's the final part of this, the why is your response. And response is like a great way to reinforce, Yubi, do you mind moving on to the why?
Sorry, yeah. I was responding in the chat.
I mean, response is really the way to reinforce that you actually actively listen, that you were hearing the other person. Some of the ways that you can start showing that you're listening to the other person is restate what you heard. Restate what you heard that they value, and then honestly ask more questions. Going back to our curiosity section, the way we actually ask more questions and really try to understand the other person, that's how we're going to be able to really build empathy and start building our communication skills. So that way, when someone's tone of voice could be interpreted, or someone's body posture can be interpreted, or eye contact, when we ask more questions, we start building better communication, and we can actually start responding to people more thoughtfully.
Yeah. Hey, Nina, do you want to do, because there's a fun exercise that we share with everybody. That's a great way to practice this. It's called pet peeve. So maybe Nina, you and I can do it real quick, like do a quick example. So I'll give you, so basically I'm going to do like 60 seconds of one of my pet peeves. And then Nina is going to kind of respond back with really like what she's heard. What is it that I'm actually trying to say? So here we go. We'll demonstrate. So one of my pet peeves is traffic. Like I absolutely, and COVID has been a blessing, but I hate wasting time in the car. I hate getting stuck in traffic. I don't understand why we don't have, like, you know, in the movie Minority Report, just like autonomous vehicles. Like, how are we not created that yet? I don't like wasting time between 2 points when I could be doing something better, right? Something more meaningful and impactful. So that is my pet peeve.
All right, so what I heard is that the pet peeve on the surface is traffic, and being stuck in traffic and not being able to get to your destination. But what I'm hearing you really value is your time, that you care about having time to do the things and spend time the way you want to be doing it. And that, you know, you feel like that's a really important part of your day-to-day life, is the time that you have, and traffic takes away from that. So you care about that. I also think I heard, and this is where Yuvi's going to correct me or not, that he really values innovation and gets frustrated when the world isn't innovating around him quickly enough. And so, you know, one of the things that he frustrates him about this is the lack of innovative solutions to a problem that exists and should be addressed. How did I get it?
Yeah, that was a good one. I didn't, the innovation one. Yeah, you pulled that one out. That was nice. Why don't we have flying cars yet? I just don't understand. So that's, yeah, pet peeve. That's a great exercise for really getting to, you know, to the point. And again, you know, the active listening is important. Asking questions. So, you know, Heather, you're right. Like a lot of people, for example, who was really trained to be a good interviewer? None of us. But I will say what's the most important part of that kind of conversation, or even this kind of conversation, are the questions. The questions are key, because, and how we ask the questions and what we're listening for is critical to better understanding each other and really understanding what someone is trying to tell us.
Yeah, like one of the things that we need to start challenging ourselves is when we're listening to someone, trying to really understand what they value and care about. While, you know, a situation at work might be that someone's really angry about, you know, not getting a project that they really wanted. You could start diving into it and start start figuring out, well, what is it that is really frustrating them? What's the core to this? Like, are they frustrated because they feel like they're not being seen, valued, and heard? Are they frustrated because they don't find that they're getting the growth opportunities that they want by getting that project, there's opportunities to start asking questions and get to the core of what it is, and it not just being at the surface level.
So I'll just add to that, just the pet peeve. So we covered like the basics, but I call that almost on the surface. What I would be asking would be more, how do you make traffic time more productive? And I think back to like when I went to college, I was listening to books on tape. I was a new supervisor at the time, and so I wanted, to listen to leadership things, or I use that time to think through things. I'm interested what else is behind that traffic time is wasted time? What other examples do you have of wasted time?
That's a great point.
Those are great follow-up questions.
I'm like,
You can do this exercise with UV.
I don't think I'm prepared. Yeah.
So I mean, I tend to go like a little bit. I was like, well, that's nice, but I'm seeing a couple things here.
No, that's great. I mean, that's a great example. I don't know. I think it's the like, I don't necessarily like, I don't know. I don't know. Those are hard questions. Wow. I got to think about that. Someone had to email you guys back, but And I
don't know is a perfectly valid response too. I think sometimes when we're having these conversations, like the person who's talking might not know their own core, like what do they value, what do they really want, right? And I think it's okay for people to say, I don't know, and for it to just be a moment to be like, that's okay. Like, let's both reflect on this and think.
I think the point with that is, that subconscious. Is say sometimes you don't know what kind of messages are coming through in even a pet peeve like that.
Right.
They say, I don't know, I haven't explored that, or trigger points, that they're saying, we can really just, pushing my buttons. Why?
Yeah.
I hear like the 5 whys. I love that one.
Yeah, that is a good one to kind of get down to the core of it. So, that's a great point. It's a great point. There are a lot of things that drive us, and we don't necessarily know what those are. But again, now that I'm more aware, now that you've asked me the question, I'm like, I can spend some time digging into it and figuring it out. Maybe it's that selfishly I want someone else to drive me around. I don't know. Maybe that's it. Awesome. Well, thank you. That was a good conversation. So let's close up this part, and then we'll close up the session with discussion again around some of these concepts and where conscious communication really has a direct impact on our lives, specifically today. But again, why does this matter? Being able to be more aware of how we fully communicate, verbally and non-verbally, and consciously choosing then to be more clear and transparent in how we communicate goes a long way, right? That goes a long way in people being able to better understand who we are and where we're coming from, and vice versa. And then it allows us to bring our authentic selves into any of those conversations, right? Like, that's what we're trying to help organizations achieve, is a place where everybody can come be their authentic self. And that means how they communicate verbally and non-verbally, how they think, how they innovate, whatever. It's whoever they are, if they have the ability to truly bring themselves to work every single day, knowing that they're going to feel like they belong, communication is a huge part of that. And then, conscious communication, it gives us the ability to communicate with more influence, to bring more value through our roles and what we're doing every single day. Because if first we are able to stay true to ourselves and communicate authentically, that will then help with whatever it is we're trying to accomplish individually and as a team. Because then it's all out there, right? It's all out there on the table, and there's no behaviors or hiding behind different things that will prevent us from really truly presenting the idea that we want to present, for example. So these are all critical parts to how our teams can become more cohesive and produce better products and services that really reach and impact a wider group of people. So tying it all together, you know, this awareness of our own biases, how our brains work, and then bringing in this empathy model and this understanding of how empathy works really leads to just a true conscious way of communicating that is true to ourselves. It honors the truth and authenticity of others. And, you know, I think we can do better things together when we have that with each other, have that as an organization. All right, so now we're going to talk about these 4 concepts to kind of close out the hour, because these are things that are at play constantly within our organizations, within our teams, within our homes, within our communities. And, you know, I think there are certain definitions that we've heard here and there that relate to these, but again, there's a layer here, there's multiple layers here that we need to understand. And then, you know, how these apply to how we're communicating with each other on a daily basis. And so I'll kick it off with the first 3, and then Nina will walk us through dehumanization as the last piece, because that one's where this all sort of comes into play, right? So hierarchy, what is it, right? Hierarchy is this system or organization like we have at work. It involves titles, roles and responsibilities, rankings based on power and authority, and status, the ability to share status. So that's what hierarchy is. We find it formally in organizations. We find it informally in households, or even in communities and things like that. So hierarchy is one of those things that we've created to for organizational purposes. And then within that, we've got these 2 concepts of power versus status. So power is that thing that comes with the title. It's that responsibility related to being in a long-term position of control. And it's just associated with that and with hierarchy. Whereas status is something that can actually be passed from one person to another, no matter the role or whatever. It's something that can be shared, very much like in football when the quarterback passes the ball to the wide receiver. That's sharing status. And so it's important for us to understand how status plays out within our organizations. Does anybody have an example of how status might be passed on your team?
Could that be depending on the types of roles that person takes on? The type of projects or exposure related to those roles or projects?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a part of it. I think, you know, in that scenario, that, you know, that may be where like a team lead is giving someone on the team an opportunity to take on a project and lead a project within the team, right? So that's passing status. So yeah, that's a great example. The key to status is, though, the other person does have to accept it. And so in order for status to work like that, it has to be that passing of and accepting of the status. But yeah, it's that kind of scenario where a leader is asking someone on the team to take lead on a project, or you know, someone, you know, team meetings, right, or Monday stand-ups or weekly stand-ups like that, where the rotation, there's a rotation of who's leading those meetings every week or every day. That's status. That's passing of status. Katie,
this example is also really great. Just simply like calling out someone, especially if you're in a position of authority, calling out someone's achievements. Yeah. That's a great example of passing status.
What about mentorship?
Yes. Mentorship again, and that comes down to the passing and receiving of status, right? When you're mentoring someone, you're actually helping mentor them on how to receive status as well. Because receiving status is something that is often not something that, especially people from marginalized groups have been able to do a lot. And so mentorship is really critical to making sure that status can be passed and received. So teaching your team members about this concept, about how others can pass status, but also how can people be ready to take that project on if you've been given a project, who's mentoring you to make sure that you're able to succeed with that.
Yeah, that's a great one. And that's a great lead in, Nina, to your discussion.
Yeah, so let's talk about dehumanization. So basically, dehumanization is the act of putting someone down. It's the opposite of passing status. So instead, it's about stripping status and preventing future status passes. So like in that football example, an example of someone, stripping someone of status or dehumanizing someone would be to say, hey, pass it to me, not to him. He can't throw. So like these types of dehumanizations, well, first of all, we have to recognize that literally everyone has done this at some point. And we are capable of doing this to ourselves, and we probably all have done this to ourselves. And in a lot of cases, those who have been dehumanized by others are likely to also actually perpetrate it itself. So if you've been dehumanized, you're likely to do it too. And so we have to start recognizing exactly what is happening with these moments of dehumanization. And so some of the results, and this is really common, we see this happen in offices all the time, a culture that includes a strategic withholding of status instead of a strategic passing of status can really be really harmful. And so some of the things that can end up happening is that some people will start feeling disengaged and apathetic. They won't feel like they have a sense of belonging. They won't feel valued. And so they'll end up getting a sense of very low self-worth. And that leads to lower motivation and actually like producing and being a part of a team. And office politics occur all the time as part of this. So like, an example of, how dehumanization could play out is that different teams are competing for a project, or different people are trying to get access to resources or attention from leaders. When employees aren't past status and are routinely stripped of status through everyday dehumanization, people become really disengaged.
Yeah, the dehumanization, this type of dehumanization is what can derail most diversity initiatives, because if we're forcing diversity, but we've created a culture where this type of withholding of status from people who were, diverse groups or underrepresented groups of people who we're trying to bring into the organization, if we're forcing that and creating a culture though where this kind of dehumanization is supported and thrives, that doesn't work. That diversity initiative is a failure. And this is, dehumanization is I think we've all or a lot of us heard of Brene Brown and how she defines it, right? And so that's the definition that sticks in everybody's head, is this idea that one group of people is made to feel less human than sort of the standard group of people, for example, in this country. And so, but to what Nina's talking about here is these are the layers of how this exists beyond that, right? That's like the core example of dehumanization, but this is what we're all doing to each other every day.
Yeah. And so let's show you some quick examples of, how dehumanization can play out. So one example are put down. So smart people do this. You don't like pizza? Everyone likes pizza. What you're doing is you're putting down someone and stripping them of that understanding of like they have their own sense of wants, needs, likes. And that goes into the dismissal. Oh, he's just angry, or she's just angry, or I don't know a single instance where someone telling someone else to calm down has led to that person actually calming down. And so, and the other one is like putting someone in their place. Like, you wouldn't understand this. You're essentially saying like they're too stupid to understand something. And that's a form of dehumanization. So we do want to distinguish the difference between dehumanization and microaggressions, because I'm sure you've heard the term microaggressions all the time. So the microaggressions are basically all of the dehumanization stuff that we're talking about, but it's wrapped in the context of a group of people that have historically been stripped of power. So when we think about different groups of people, whether it be people of color, the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, all of these groups have historically, were not allowed to receive status and not allowed to receive power. And so dehumanizations are going to hit differently for people from these marginalized groups. And that's why it's microaggressions, because we need to start recognizing that dehumanization is going to feel different to a person who's part of a group that's historically been stripped of that power. So we have to start thinking about that and being aware of that as well. So what are some of the actions we can take to start combating this? So the first thing we have to do is we have to learn how to spot it. This requires that self-reflection, awareness. This is work again, where, we have to start actively listening for some of those phrases that, we hear every day that are potentially dehumanizing other people. And it might not just be things that are spotted towards you, but you might see these types of dehumanizations happening in a room, towards other people. So when you start spotting it, then you can actually start to address it. So what we need to do is, an example of what you could say is, did you hear the dehumanization in that statement? There's no need to necessarily derail the whole conversation, but when you just simply say, did you hear the dehumanization in that statement? What you're doing is you're just letting people know. You're letting people know that this is something that happened, and it's an opportunity for you to let it go, but it allows people to start bringing their own awareness to the situation so they can start spotting it, and then they can start addressing it as well. And then the final part is really around that receiving and passing status. Like, this is where organizational change can be so powerful, because once we start creating that culture of mentorship, of really figuring out, recognizing where power and hierarchy and status all play in our day-to-day interactions, we can start helping people pass and receive status. And we can do that in our teams, we can do that in our departments, we can do that with just our peers. So it's stuff that we need to really start thinking about, to start breaking down what are the actions that we can take to start dismantling these systems.
Yeah, again, this is all driven by awareness. I think almost it's almost more important to create a culture of awareness and understanding, because now that we all are on the same page about what dehumanization and microaggressions are, it becomes much easier to call that out or to make someone aware of that by saying what Nina said, which is, hey, did you hear the dehumanization in that? Now we all have a common understanding of what that means, and I can immediately go back and say, yes, actually I do. Thank you for that awareness, right? So that awareness is a key driver and thread throughout all of this, and it's what should drive our conscious efforts to be better. Awareness of our bias, awareness of how our empathy works, awareness of how we communicate verbally and non-verbally will drive to make us better. So, all right, that is it. Any questions? Yeah, Monica, you make a great point. It's, again, that's why curiosity is so important, because if it sounds less accusatory. It's more about, showing someone else that you're indeed very curious about what they said and why they said it, as opposed to just making a snap judgment or statement of, well, you said this because you're racist. Not necessarily, no. Well, this has been awesome. Lacey, thank you again for this opportunity. This has really been a great series with all of you. And feel free to reach out to Nina and myself if anybody ever has questions or comments or wants to share anything. But again, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you both for
Thank you.
presenting and being a part of it. You've helped, I think, educate us as Dish and bring this awareness to keep those conversations going. So we greatly appreciate your partnership with these series and helping everyone. And I want to thank everybody who's been able to attend these. Thank you guys for being open to learning more and being a part. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.